A shadow over Port Charles. The night Laura, Britt, and Jason crossed a line they can never uncross. There are nights in Port Charles when the air itself seems to hold its breath, when every shadow feels like a secret waiting to unravel, and when even the most steadfast souls find themselves standing on the trembling edge of right and wrong. This was one of those nights, a night that began with Laura Collins clutching her steering wheel in disbelief as the lifeless body of Professor Hank Dalton shifted in the trunk of her car, a weight far heavier than flesh alone could account for. She had not expected to become the unwilling keeper of such a terrible burden. She had not expected her hands to tremble like a criminal's. And she certainly had not expected Jason Morgan to meet her in the dim, abandoned clearing outside Port Charles, where moonlight fell in shards and the air smelled of pine, gasoline, and fear. Laura said nothing as Jason lifted the body from the trunk. Nothing when he covered the man whose corruption had left trails of wreckage across the hospital and across so many lives. Nothing when he nodded at her as though this was merely another problem to be erased. She simply stood there, swallowing the guilt rising like a bitter tide, aware that one wrong word to the wrong person could dismantle everything she had built, her reputation, her leadership, her fragile hold on peace. She had no choice but to stay silent. And silence, she would soon learn, can become its own kind of weapon. Across town, Britt Westbourne was navigating her own battlefield. Though her name had been tied to Dalton's work, though whispers followed her like ghosts in the night, she was trying, desperately, to cling to the hope that the worst was behind her. But Port Charles is not a town that allows survivors to simply move on. It drags the past back into the light with merciless precision, especially when figures like Jen Sidwell move through its shadows with ambition sharper than any scalpel. Britt's day had begun like any other, tense, hurried, layered with unspoken dread. But it shattered the moment she opened an encrypted message sent from an anonymous account, though she recognized the signature behind the cruelty instantly. Sidwell's tone was unmistakable, clinical, taunting, purposeful. He had sent her a file. A grotesque one. And inside it was the truth of what he had done to Laura Collins. Not physically, not yet, but psychologically. He had engineered a scenario designed to trap Laura, confuse her, and ultimately destroy her credibility should she ever dare speak against him. The file detailed how Dalton's body had been maneuvered to ensure Laura would be the one to discover him first. How recordings of her panic existed. How the narrative could be twisted at any moment to make Laura appear complicit in Dalton's death or cover-up. It was a threat disguised as documentation, a neat, sterile summary of calculated cruelty. Britt's stomach lurched. Her hands curled into fists. To her horror, she felt rage mixing with something even darker, responsibility. She had known Sidwell was dangerous, but she had underestimated the lengths he would go. And the thought that she might have been used, even indirectly, in his sick game made her blood boil. She threw the tablet across the room, its screen cracking like shattered ice. She didn't care. The damage was done. Sidwell's fingerprints were all over Laura's suffering, and whether Britt liked it or not, she was now holding the truth. Truth so foul, so dangerous, she couldn't even trust herself with it. The hospital corridors suddenly felt too narrow, the fluorescent lights too harsh. She needed to get out. She needed to breathe. But most of all, she needed someone she could trust. Once, she had believed she had that in Jason Morgan. But trust, she had learned, was a fragile currency. And Jason had already broken it once. Meanwhile, Jason was navigating the wreckage of the night more methodically than emotionally, at least on the surface. He had disposed of Dalton's body with the practiced precision of a man who had done it before, but this time something was different. This time the weight of what he had done, and why he had done it, lingered behind his ribs like a bruise. He had acted to protect Laura, yes. But he had also acted for Britt. And for reasons he still wasn't ready to admit, that made everything more complicated. He found Britt outside the hospital, staring at the cracked tablet like it contained the ashes of her last hope. Her anger was palpable, vibrating in the air like static. He approached her slowly, aware that her silence was far more dangerous than her words. He started with what he thought she needed to hear, that he was still on her side, that he was trying to protect her, that everything he had done that night was part of a larger plan to keep her safe. But Britt was no longer the woman willing to take comfort in the promise of protection. She had been burned, betrayed, threatened, and manipulated too many times. She crossed her arms, forcing Jason to face a truth he couldn't dodge. Trust couldn't be commanded. It had to be earned. And he had not earned it back. Jason tried again, softer this time. He told her Laura was safe, that no one would ever trace Dalton's disappearance back to her. That Sidwell's power was weakening. That together they could dismantle him before he cemented his next move. But Britt only tightened her jaw. Because the truth, the devastating truth, was that she didn't trust Jason enough to put her life in his hands anymore. Not when Sidwell's threats could swallow her whole. Not when Jason's loyalty was divided between too many fronts. Not when she had already seen how easily he could walk away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The night wind pressed against them, cool and heavy. The hospital lights glowed behind them like watchful eyes. Britt finally broke the silence, not with words, but with a step backward. A small shift. A tremor of distance so subtle yet so defining that Jason felt it like a blade. He reached out, not to touch her, but to anchor her with the truth he hadn't dared speak before. He told her he needed her trust. That he couldn't stop Sidwell alone. That everything was spinning out of control faster than even he could manage. But Britt's eyes, though conflicted, held a pain that had been sharpened by betrayal. She shook her head. Jason didn't argue. He simply watched her walk away, her steps quick, her shoulders tight, as though carrying a weight she no longer wanted him to lighten. And in that moment, Jason realized that the battle against Sidwell was not the only one he stood to lose. Because if he failed to protect Britt, not just from Sidwell, but from the darkness consuming her, he would lose her too. Maybe forever. Across town, Laura Collins locked her office door and sat alone in the dark. The night's silence pressed against her, heavy with guilt. She knew the price of truth. She knew the cost of secrets. She knew the danger of believing she could control the narrative of a crime she hadn't committed but was now tangled in. She closed her eyes, unaware that the storm Britt had uncovered was already gathering force, inching closer, threatening to swallow them all. And in the center of that storm, Sidwell waited, calculating, patient, and more dangerous than ever.